The costume was already finished. That was the thought that stopped Henry Brooks cold in the doorway of Caroline Gentry's shop, his breath coming hard and fast from 3 blocks of running, his hand still gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The dress dummy in the corner wore a complete outfit: worn brown canvas trousers, a faded red flannel shirt, a battered leather vest with brass buttons, and a wide-brimmed hat caked in trail dust. It was not a woman's costume. It was not decorative. It was a working man's disguise, assembled with such precision that Henry felt the hair on the back of his neck stand at full attention. His eyes cut from the dummy to the woman standing behind the cutting table, her dark auburn hair pinned back in a practical knot, her green eyes watching him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and sharp suspicion. "You need something," Caroline said. It was not a question. Henry's jaw worked. He had maybe 8 minutes. 8 minutes before Marshal Dawes and his 2 deputies finished their sweep of the south end of Caldwell, Kansas, and turned their attention to the main street. 8 minutes before they found him. 8 minutes before a trap he had not seen coming slammed shut around him like a bear trap around a rabbit's leg. "I need a disguise," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended. "Right now, whatever you've got." Caroline Gentry folded her arms across her chest and looked at him with those unnervingly calm green eyes, and then she looked at the dummy in the corner, and then she looked back at him with an expression that could only be described as complicated. "How tall are you?" she asked. 6'1". "Wait. What does that wait, Mr. Brooks?" He blinked. She knew his name. He had never set foot in this shop before today. His hand moved instinctively toward the Colt on his hip and stopped just as fast, because she was not threatening him. She was measuring him. With her eyes efficiently and without any particular self-consciousness, she was calculating. "190 pounds," he said slowly. She walked to the dummy in the corner, lifted the hat from its wooden head, crossed the room in 4 quick steps, and held it out to him. "Put it on," she said. "All of it." Henry stood very still. "That outfit was already made. You made it before I walked in here." "Yes," Caroline said with infuriating composure. "How did you know I was coming?" Her eyes met his without flinching, without guilt, without any of the tells that a liar would show, and she said, "I didn't know you were coming. I knew someone was coming. Now put it on, because you have about 6 minutes left, and once you are dressed you are going to tell me exactly why 3 United States Marshals are hunting a bounty hunter through my town." He took the hat. Because Henry Brooks had been hunting dangerous men across the territories for 11 years, and in 11 years he had learned that the most dangerous thing in the world was not a man with a gun. It was a woman who had already thought 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. He just had not expected to fall in love with one. The story of how Henry Brooks ended up in Caroline Gentry's shop on a blazing Wednesday afternoon in June of 1878 was the kind of story that started 6 weeks earlier, 300 miles to the south, in a cattle town called Wichita, where everything had gone completely and spectacularly wrong. Henry had been chasing a man named Doyle Prute for 4 months. Prute was a bank robber and a killer, a former Confederate guerrilla who had spent the years since the war practicing the same skills he had honed during it. And he was clever enough and violent enough that the reward on his head had climbed to $800, which in 1878 was enough money to buy a small ranch and still have enough left over for seed and cattle. Henry had been tracking him through Indian Territory, through the eastern edge of Texas, and finally north into Kansas. And he had been this close to taking him in Wichita when Marshal Luther Dawes had decided to complicate things. Dawes was a problem that Henry had been avoiding for the better part of 2 years. The man wore a badge legitimately enough, but his methods were the kind that made experienced men uncomfortable and young deputies eager to please. He ran protection for certain establishments in Wichita. He looked the other way for certain men. And he had a particular and personal objection to bounty hunters operating in his territory, which Henry suspected had less to do with jurisdiction and more to do with the fact that bounty hunters who brought men intended to make marshals answer uncomfortable questions about why those men had been running free so long. When Henry had cornered Prout in a Wichita boarding house, he had been 2 seconds from a clean capture. Prout's hands had been up. The money had been as good as in Henry's pocket. Then Dawes had walked through the door with 2 deputies behind him, taken one look at the situation, and arrested Henry for operating without a territorial license, a regulation so obscure and so inconsistently enforced that Henry had never once heard it invoked in 11 years of working. Prout had walked out, while Henry sat in a Wichita jail cell for 9 days. When Henry finally got out, his license paperwork having mysteriously failed to process for over a week, Prout was long gone, and Dawes had made it very clear, in the quiet way that dangerous men made things clear, that Henry was not welcome in his territory. Henry had ignored him and kept riding north. He had tracked Prout to Caldwell, which sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, and had the particular energy of a town that existed in the space between 2 sets of laws, and was consequently governed by neither very well. It was a cattle town, a trail town, a place where Texas longhorns were driven north, and where money and whiskey and trouble moved in equal measure. Henry had ridden in 3 days ago, quiet and careful, and he had found Prout's trail. The man was hiding in a farmstead 5 miles east of town, waiting for his contact to bring fresh horses before pushing north into Nebraska. Henry had been 1 day away from ending this. Then this morning, in the boarding house where he had taken a room under a false name, the woman who brought his breakfast had whispered without looking at him that 3 men with federal badges were asking about a big man with a gray hat and a bay horse named after a river. The horse's name was Missouri. Henry had named him that because the horse had a particularly stubborn and unpredictable temperament that reminded him of that state. He had left the boarding house through the back window, left Missouri in the livery, because taking the horse would have made him too visible, and spent 20 minutes moving through back alleys trying to think. Dawes had followed him north, which meant Dawes was serious about making him disappear, which meant Henry was in genuine danger, because Dawes was the kind of man who had no hesitation about making a bounty hunter's death look like a simple frontier misfortune. He needed to not look like himself. He needed a disguise convincing enough to walk past 3 lawmen in broad daylight, make it to the east edge of town, and get Prout before Dawes found him first. The costume shop had been a last, desperate thought. He had seen it 2 days ago while checking the town's geography. A small establishment sandwiched between a hardware store and a milliner's, its window displaying a remarkably detailed period costume that looked like it belonged on a theater stage rather than a Kansas street. A painted sign above the door read, "Caroline Gentry Costumes, Theatrical Dress, and Custom Garments." He had thought at the time that it was an unusual business for a town like Caldwell. He had not thought about it again until this morning. Now he stood behind the curtain that Caroline had yanked across the shop's small changing alcove and pulled on the worn canvas trousers with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. The trousers fit with an accuracy that was startling, not tight, not loose, exactly the right length at the ankle, with a wear pattern at the knee that suggested years of kneeling on hard ground. The flannel shirt was the same. The vest was the same. Even the boots left beside the dummy. A pair of cracked, trail-worn working boots that he guessed at size 10, before he tried them on and found them exact were the same. He stepped out from behind the curtain and Caroline looked at him the way a craftsman looks at a finished piece, assessing, checking her own work. "Tuck the shirt in on the right side only," she said. "Not a man who is trying to hide his gun, a man who is too busy to bother with his shirt." Henry did it. Push the hat back an inch. Too far forward reads like a man trying to shade his face. He pushed it back. Now walk to the door and back. He did, feeling self-conscious in a way he could not remember feeling since he was 17, and Caroline watched his gait with those sharp green eyes, and something crossed her face, not quite satisfaction but close to it. You walk like a hunter, she said. Try to drag your right foot very slightly. A tired cattle hand who has been on a drive for 6 weeks does not pick his feet up. He tried it. Better, she said, and then she moved to the window and looked out between the curtains with a calm, practiced economy of motion that told him she had checked streets carefully before more than once, for reasons he did not yet understand. 2 of them just past the hardware store, she said, walking south. The third went into the hotel across the street 10 minutes ago and hasn't come back out. Henry went very still. You were watching them before I got here. I was watching them, she said. Yes. Why? She turned from the window and looked at him, and for a moment something shifted behind her eyes, something that was not quite fear but was in the same family as it, something she was keeping carefully controlled. Because I recognized Luther Dawes, she said, and I know what Luther Dawes coming to a town quietly means for anyone he is looking for. The silence in the shop was thick and particular. You know Dawes, Henry said. Sit down, Mr. Brooks, Caroline said. Not because I am being hospitable, but because a standing man can be seen through the window gap, and we have approximately 4 minutes to wait before the marshal on the hotel side changes his position. Henry sat down in the wooden chair beside her cutting table, and he looked at this woman, this composed, watchful, infuriatingly competent woman, and he understood that she was not simply a costume maker who happened to have a useful disguise ready. She was something else entirely, and whatever that something was, it was connected to Luther Dawes in a way that had pulled her into this situation as surely as it had pulled him. Tell me, he said. And Caroline Gentry, who had been Caroline Hale before she left St. Louis 4 years ago with nothing but her sewing equipment and her mother's pattern books, and a determination so ferocious it had taken her 2,000 miles west, sat down across from him and began. She had been a theatrical costumer in St. Louis, the best in the city, according to the Grand Opera House and the 3 repertory theater companies that had fought each other for her services. She had a mind for construction, for detail, for the way fabric behaved under light and movement, and she had built herself a reputation and a comfortable living before she was 25. She was 28 now. Luther Dawes had come through St. Louis in the spring of 1875, pursuing a fugitive, and he had been introduced to Caroline at a social function through a mutual acquaintance. He had pursued her with the same focused determination he apparently brought to everything, and she had been careful and polite and firm about declining him, because something in his manner had struck her as wrong in a way she could not quite articulate. He had not taken the decline well. 3 weeks later, her business partner and friend, a man named Thomas Hale, her deceased husband's brother, who had helped her establish the costume shop after she was widowed, had been arrested on a charge of receiving stolen property. The evidence had been thin to the point of transparency, but it had been enough to hold him for 2 months while the case was examined, and in those 2 months the shop had faltered badly, and Thomas, who was 53 years old and had a weak heart, had not survived the jail. Caroline had never been able to prove it was Dawes. She had never been able to prove anything, but she had known. She had sold the St. Louis shop, packed her equipment, and headed west because in a city like St. Louis, Dawes had connections and she had none, and she understood that staying was not an option. She had settled in Caldwell 18 months ago because it was remote enough and busy enough that a woman with practical skills could build something without drawing the attention that a larger city brought. She had been building something, a real business, a real life. And then this morning, Luther Dawes had ridden into Caldwell, and Caroline had recognized him from across the street with a recognition that felt like cold water dropped on hot iron. So when you saw him this morning, Henry said slowly, you made the disguise. I had the materials from a theater commission I completed last month, Caroline said. A traveling production wanted a kit for their leading man who plays a frontier scout. I had everything on hand. And I thought, she paused, and something in her expression shifted. I thought that if Dawes was here hunting someone, and if that someone got desperate enough, they might come to a costume shop. And if they did, I wanted to be useful. Henry looked at her for a long moment. You made that entire outfit this morning, after seeing him. I so quickly, Caroline said without apology. That is not a normal reaction to seeing a dangerous man in your town. No, she agreed. But I am not a woman who sits in a corner and waits to see what happens to her. I tried that once. It cost me Thomas. So now I prepare and I act and I figure out what use I can be. Outside, somewhere down the street, a horse whinnied. Both of them went still, listening, and then the sound resolved itself into nothing more alarming than the ordinary afternoon movement of a cattle town in June. Henry looked down at his hands. He thought about Doyle Prout, 5 miles east, waiting for his horses. He thought about $800. He thought about Dawes, who had already put him in one jail cell and would not hesitate to do something more permanent this time. He thought about this woman, who had made a disguise for an unknown person out of sheer forward-thinking competence and personal history, and he felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. "What do you want in return?" he asked, because 11 years of bounty hunting had taught him that everyone wanted something, and that people who appeared to be helping for free were usually not. Caroline folded her hands on the cutting table. "I want Dawes to leave this town and have a reason not to come back. I can't arrest a marshal. I'm not asking you to arrest him. I'm asking you to do your job. Bring in Prout." Prout has been protected by Dawes for years. Everyone in the territory knows it, but no one can prove it because Dawes keeps eliminating the problems. If you bring Prout in, especially if you bring him in through a different jurisdiction, Dawes loses his protection and his income stream, and men like Dawes, when they lose those things, have the sense to retreat and find a quieter arrangement elsewhere. Henry stared at her. "How do you know about Dawes and Prout?" "I have been in Caldwell for 18 months, Caroline said patiently. "I sew costumes and dresses and work clothes for a significant portion of this town's population. People talk while they are being fitted. I listen." "You have been collecting intelligence," Henry said, not quite believing what he was hearing. "I have been paying attention," she said, with a precision that made it clear she considered the distinction important. "Now, you have roughly 2 minutes before the pattern of movement I have been tracking puts both east-facing deputies at the end of this block. If you leave through my back door, cross the tanner's yard, and go through the gap between the grain store and the feed merchant, you will come out on the east road without crossing any line of sight they currently hold. Can you get to Prout on foot?" 5 miles, Henry said. "I have a horse in my back lot, a gray mare named Clara. She is quiet and she is fast and she looks nothing like a bay named Missouri. Take her." Henry stood up. He looked at Caroline Gentry, at the careful composure of her, the intelligence working visibly behind those green eyes, the way she was doing precise calculations in her head even as she spoke to him, and he felt that nameless thing move through him again, clearer this time. "Why are you trusting me?" he asked. "I am not trusting you," Caroline said, standing as well, moving to the back door with quiet efficiency. "I am making a calculated investment. You have a reputation, Mr. Brooks. 11 years, 63 captures, not one excessive force complaint filed against you that stuck. You do not hurt people who do not need to be hurt. That is rare enough in your profession to be noteworthy. You looked me up. I looked you up 3 days ago when you rode into town," she said, opening the back door onto a narrow yard where a dappled gray mare stood tied to a post, already saddled. Come back when you have Prout. If you do not come back, I will understand, but try to come back." She said that last part quietly and quickly, and then she turned back into the shop without waiting to see if he had heard it. He had heard it. He went. The ride out to the Prout farmstead was the longest 5 miles Henry had ridden in recent memory, partly because he was riding carefully, staying off the main road, cutting through the tall grass of the Kansas summer that smelled like heat and dust and possibility, and partly because his mind was doing something it almost never did while he was working, which was wander. It kept wandering back to a woman with auburn hair and green eyes who had sewn a disguise for a stranger on the reasonable theory that someone desperate might need it. He pulled his mind back to the task. The farmstead was a low, tired-looking property, a soddy main house, a leaning wooden barn, a dry creek bed running along the east edge of the property. Henry tied the gray mare in a draw 200 yards north, checked his colt, and circled wide around the property with the particular focused quiet of a man who had done this more times than he could easily count. Prout was in the barn. Henry knew it before he got close enough to confirm it, because of the horses. There were 4 of them in the barn's small corral, 2 old working animals that went with the property and 2 that were fresh and well-fed, and had the look of horses kept ready for travel. The contact had already come. Prout was probably preparing to leave that evening. Henry had not arrested Doyle Prout in 4 months of chasing him, but he had studied the man with the particular thoroughness that competent bounty hunters bring to their work, and he knew that Prout was dangerous but not irrational, that the man had a pattern of backing down from a clearly losing position and fighting only when he thought he had an advantage, and that he was fundamentally a calculating person underneath the violence. Henry walked into the barn through the side door with his colt level and his voice completely steady. "Prout," he said, "it's over. Hands where I can see them." Doyle Prout was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s with pale eyes and a 3-day beard, and he was sitting on a hay bale checking his saddlebags when Henry walked in. He looked up, measured the situation in about 2 seconds and put his hands up. "Brooks," he said, "I heard Dawes had you locked up." "He let me go," Henry said, moving forward, keeping the colt level, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. Prout let himself be cuffed without resistance, which was the calculating behavior Henry had predicted, and as Henry fastened the cuffs he said, very quietly, "Dawes is not going to be happy about this." "That is generally the point," Henry said. He got Prout up onto one of the fresh horses, took the reins, and rode north by northwest, not back toward Caldwell, but toward the county seat at Sumner, where the sheriff had no relationship with Dawes, and where Prout would be held in a jurisdiction that Dawes had no reach into. It added 3 hours to the ride, but Henry had been doing this long enough to understand that a captured man delivered to the wrong hands was sometimes worse than no capture at all. He stopped long enough to find a farmhouse, where the woman of the property, suspicious, practical, with a rifle in her hands and a sharp eye for trouble, allowed him to write and send a telegram to the Sumner County Sheriff from her husband's equipment, explaining what he had and when he would arrive, and requesting that the capture be formally logged before Dawes could file any kind of interference or challenge. The farmer's wife, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Albrecht and had the bearing of a woman who had survived things that would have undone a lesser person, fed him cold corn bread and well water while he waited for the confirmation reply, and looked at Prout the way women on the frontier sometimes look at men who have made the world worse, which is with a cold and total contempt that is somehow more withering than anything a man could muster. By the time Henry delivered Prout to Sumner and had the paperwork processed and countersigned, it was well past dark. The reward authorization would take several days to process through the proper channels, but it was filed, official, and beyond Dawes' reach. Prout was in a cell. The thing that had been haunting Henry's trail for 4 months was done. He rode back toward Caldwell in the warm Kansas dark, and he told himself he was going back to get Missouri from the livery and return the gray mare whose name was Clara, and he was mostly telling himself the truth. He arrived in Caldwell near midnight. The town was not quite asleep cattle towns rarely were, and lamplight fell from the saloon windows in the hotel and a few other establishments, making warm gold puddles on the dirt street. Henry put Clara back in the small lot behind Caroline's shop, checked that she had water and fresh hay from the adjacent pile, and then stood in the dark lot and looked at the back of the shop for a moment. There was a light on inside. He knocked on the back door, 2 knocks, then 1, which was not a signal they had arranged but which felt less alarming than simply hammering on someone's door at midnight. The door opened almost immediately, which meant she had been awake and probably listening. Caroline stood in the doorway with a lamp in one hand and her hair down around her shoulders, which gave her a different quality than the composed, precise woman he had left this morning, softer in some way, but no less watchful. She looked at him, all of him, checking for damage the way a practical person checks, and then she looked past him at the gray mare in the lot and nodded. "Clara is all right?" she asked. "She is fine. Fast and sure-footed. Good horse." "She belonged to my husband," Caroline said, and then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in." Henry came in. The back room of the shop was the working space, cutting tables, a dress form, shelves of folded fabric in colors that were extraordinary for a frontier town, spools of thread ranked by shade, a large black sewing machine of a kind that Henry recognized as one of the new Singer models, with its characteristic scroll work and its treadle gleaming with use. It was an expensive, professional piece of equipment, and it sat in that back room with the authority of a tool that was used hard and well. In the corner was a small stove and a kettle, and Caroline moved toward it with the ease of someone in their own space. "Prute?" she asked. "In Sumner County Jail," Henry said, "filed and processed. Dawes can't touch it." Something moved across Caroline's face, relief, but deeper than the word usually carries, the kind of relief that has been held in compression for a long time and is now released all at once. She set the lamp down on the cutting table and put both hands flat on the surface and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. "Good," she said quietly. "That's good." Henry pulled off the borrowed hat, still wearing the disguise, he realized, which seemed suddenly both practical and slightly absurd, and set it on the end of the cutting table. He was tired in the particular way that comes after sustained tension finally releases, which is a deeper tiredness than physical exertion alone, and he found a stool near the cutting table and sat on it without being invited, because his legs had decided they were done for the day. Caroline made tea, which was a practical and ordinary thing to do at midnight after a day like this one had been, and she brought him a cup and sat across from him at the cutting table, and for a little while they were quiet. "Dawes," Henry said eventually, "he is still in town." "He rode out around 8 this evening," Caroline said, "with his deputies. He did not find you, and I expect the word of Prute's capture will reach him quickly, and then he will understand that there is nothing here to find. He might come back, for you." "He might," Caroline said. She did not look frightened by this. She looked like a woman who has considered a thing and made her peace with the range of possible outcomes. "But I have been careful about what I have built here. I have people in this town who depend on my work. The hotel manager's wife, the school teacher, Mrs. Harlan at the mercantile, 6 families who have had dresses and work clothes made by my hands. Dawes works best when he can isolate a target. I have made myself difficult to isolate." Henry looked at her. "You have been building that protection deliberately since you got here." "Since before I got here," she said. "I understood what I was doing when I left St. Louis. I understood that the next place I went I would need to build something that could not be easily knocked down. And the intelligence gathering, the tracking of who comes and goes in town. I pay attention," she said again, with the same precise insistence on that word. "You are extraordinary," Henry said, and he had not entirely planned to say it, but it came out with a directness that surprised him because he was not generally a man who said things like that without extensive premeditation. Caroline looked at him over her teacup with those green eyes, and for a moment she looked younger than she was, or perhaps more unguarded than she usually allowed herself to be, and then she said, "You should probably sleep before you ride to wherever you are going next." "I am not sure where I am going next," Henry said. "There will be another fugitive." "There usually is," he agreed. He turned the teacup in his hands. "Your husband, the one who owned the horse." A pause. "James Gentry. He died 3 years ago, a fever. I'm sorry." "He was a good man," she said, simply and finally, which was a complete statement about the limits of what she would share on that subject, and Henry respected it. "You kept his name," he said. "It suited me better than going back to Hale," she said. "And James would have wanted me to keep building. He was not a man who believed in stopping." Henry looked at her for another moment. This remarkable, self-contained, forward-thinking woman, who had built a careful fortress of community and skill around herself in a frontier town, who had made a disguise for a stranger on the strength of pure analytical preparation, who was sitting across from him at midnight drinking tea with the composure of someone who had been expecting this exact moment, and had prepared for it too. And he thought about the road ahead of him, and about how many more years of boarding house rooms and cold trail food, and the constant grinding loneliness of a life defined by chasing other people. And he thought that he was 34 years old and had not spent more than a consecutive week in any one place in 11 years. He did not say any of that. He finished his tea, thanked her for the horse and the disguise and the information that had potentially saved his life, and went to the livery to sleep in Missouri's stall, because that was the practical and proper thing to do. But he was back the next morning. He told himself he was back because he needed to return the disguise clothing, which was reasonable, and he told himself he was back because he wanted to make sure Dawes had truly left town, which was also reasonable, and he told himself he was back because he had realized, somewhere in the warm dark of the livery, that he had a contact in Caldwell now, someone with better local intelligence than he could build himself, and that was a professional asset worth maintaining. He was lying to himself about all of it, and he knew it, and he walked into the front of the shop at 8 in the morning with the folded disguise under his arm and the knowledge, settling into him like slow rain, that he had found something here that he had not been looking for. Caroline was at her sewing machine, working with a focused intensity that meant she had been at it for a while. The machine made its rhythmic mechanical sound, and she did not look up when the bell above the door rang, because she was apparently at a critical juncture in whatever she was constructing and was not going to let an interruption cost her the line. Henry waited. After about 90 seconds, she brought the seam to a natural stopping place, stopped the treadle, looked up and saw him. Something crossed her face, something quick and controlled and complicated, which he was beginning to recognize as her particular version of surprise. "You are still here," she said. "I am returning your clothes," he said, setting the folded bundle on the counter. She nodded. She did not tell him to leave. He looked at what she was working on. It was something elaborate, a dress in deep blue fabric with a construction at the bodice that looked structurally complex in a way he did not quite understand but could recognize as sophisticated. "Theater commission?" he asked. "Wedding dress," she said, "for Mrs. Harlan's daughter. She wants something more elaborate than what most brides in this territory manage, and her mother wants her to have it, and I intend to make sure she does." Henry leaned against the counter and watched Caroline move back to her work, and he said, "How did you learn all of this? The sewing, the construction. Where does that come from?" Caroline looked up at him with a slight frown, as if assessing whether the question was genuine curiosity or something else. She apparently decided it was genuine. "My mother," she said. "She was a seamstress. A real one, trained in Philadelphia, which in the 1840s meant she had learned from women who learned from European techniques. She taught me from the time I could hold a needle. By the time I was 12, I could construct a full dress pattern from nothing but measurements. By the time I was 16, I was doing theatrical work because the theater pays better and the problems are more interesting." "Interesting," he repeated. "Costume work is not just sewing," she said, with the slight edge of someone who has had to explain this many times. "It is psychology. It is observation. You are building a version of a person. You have to understand what that person looks like from the outside, how they move, what their life has done to their body and their clothes, and you have to build all of that into the garment. A farmer's shirt does not look like a banker's shirt even if they are the same shirt, because the farmer has worn his differently. If you sew a costume without understanding that, you have just made clothing. To make a real disguise, you have to make a person." Henry was very still. "That is what you did this morning," he said, "with my disguise. I built a cattle hand who had been on a drive," she said. "The wear patterns on the trousers are at the inner knee, and the boot top, that is where cattle work puts the stress. The vest buttons are polished on the right side, where a right-handed man checks them habitually. The hat brim is shaped with more wear on the left, which is the sun side on a northbound drive. Henry stared at her. He had been wearing those clothes for 6 hours and had not noticed any of that. He was a man who made his living observing details, and he had not noticed any of it. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that you built a complete character biography into the clothes." "Yes," Caroline said, "it is what I do. In one morning. I work quickly," she said, which was the same thing she had said yesterday, and it was starting to feel like an understatement of the order that made him want to laugh and also to sit down very quietly and recalibrate everything he thought he understood about competence. He stayed in Caldwell. He told himself it was because the reward paperwork from Sumner County was going to take 2 weeks to finalize, which was true, and because he needed to wait for the official documentation before he could take his next job, which was also true. He got his room back at the boarding house, a proper room this time, not a window access situation, and he collected Missouri from the livery, and he spent the first 3 days being aggressively practical about everything. On the 4th day he came into the shop at mid-morning and asked Caroline if she had any work she needed help with. She looked at him with those measuring green eyes for a long moment. "Can you move heavy furniture?" she asked. "Yes. There is a large wardrobe in my storage room that I need repositioned. I have been waiting for someone with a sufficient number of functional back muscles." He repositioned the wardrobe. It was in fact extremely heavy and required genuine effort, and Caroline directed the operation with the same efficient precision she brought to everything, saying, "Left 3 inches, back 1, forward, stop, perfect," in a calm voice that made him feel like a particularly well-guided piece of equipment, which was not unpleasant. After that she made lunch from bread and cheese and cold meat that she kept in the back room, and they ate at the cutting table, and she told him about Caldwell, about the town's history, about the cattle drives that came through in spring and fall, about the particular social ecosystem of a trail town and how it differed from a settled farming community, about the families she had come to know and what their lives were like. She talked with the depth and detail of a person who genuinely observed the world around her, who found people interesting, who had made a study of the place where she lived. And she asked him questions, real questions, specific questions, not the vague social small talk that most conversations ran on about the territories he had ridden through, about the people he had met, about what he had seen changing in the West over 11 years of moving through it. They talked for 2 hours. Henry could not remember the last time he had talked with anyone for 2 hours about something that mattered. The days that followed had a quality that Henry would later, when he tried to describe it, call something like inevitable. Not that the outcome was ever certain. Nothing with a person like Caroline was certain, because she made her own choices with a deliberateness that precluded anyone else's certainty, but that each day he came to the shop, and each day she let him in, and each day the conversation went deeper and stayed longer, and each day something in the space between them became a little less guarded. He started noticing things about her that had nothing to do with her competence, or rather things that were connected to her competence, but were also personal, particular. The way she bit the inside of her lip very slightly when she was making a complicated calculation. The way she hummed, almost inaudibly, when she was in the middle of a piece of work that was going well, a small, unconscious sound of satisfaction. The way she moved through her shop with the ease of someone completely at home in their own space, touching this and adjusting that with a familiarity that spoke of long relationship with every object and tool. On the 8th day, she asked him about his past. They were sitting outside on the narrow wooden porch at the front of the shop in the late afternoon, because the heat inside had become oppressive and the porch caught a small breeze, and she had brought out 2 glasses of lemonade that she made herself from actual lemons, which was an extravagance that surprised him. "Where did you grow up?" she asked, just that simple and direct, the way she did everything. "Ohio," he said, "outside of Columbus, farm family, brothers and sisters." 2 brothers, 1 sister, all still in Ohio. My sister married a farmer, my brothers farmed themselves. You didn't want a farm. I wanted to see the territories, he said. From the time I could read, I wanted to see what was west. I read every account I could get my hands on Lewis and Clark, the early mountain men, all of it. When I was 23, I got on a horse and started riding west and didn't stop. And the bounty hunting. He was quiet for a moment. The first job I took was because I needed to eat. I had 50 cents and a horse and a talent for tracking. There was a posted reward in a town in Missouri for a horse thief. I tracked him, brought him in, took the money, and then another job came along, and then another. You are good at it, she said. I am very good at it, he said without false modesty, because Caroline was not a person who appreciated false modesty. Does it satisfy you? She asked. He looked at the street, at the afternoon traffic of horses and wagons and people going about the ordinary business of a summer day in Kansas, and he thought about that question with the honesty that she deserved. It used to, he said. In the early years, it was enough to be moving, to be useful, to be solving a problem that needed solving. But he paused. 11 years is a long time to sleep in other people's places and eat other people's food and be a stranger everywhere you go. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Do you want to stop? I don't know what I would stop for, he said. And then he looked at her and she looked at him, and something very clear and slightly terrifying moved between them in the warm late afternoon. And then Caroline looked away first and took a long drink of her lemonade. The reward comes in 2 days, she said. Yes. And then there will be another job. There usually is, he said, and then added with a care that he hoped was not too obvious, unless I decided to stay somewhere for a while. Caroline set her lemonade glass down with a small, precise click. Henry, yes. Are you telling me something? I am trying to, he said. I am not entirely sure how. She turned to look at him, and she had the expression of a woman who is performing a careful and honest internal assessment, which he had come to understand was how she approached everything that mattered to her. I have built something here, she said. A real thing. A business and a community and a life that belongs to me, that I built with my own hands and my own mind. And I am not willing to watch it become secondary to someone else's needs or someone else's life. I was willing to do that once, not unwillingly, not unhappily, but it cost me my own path for several years. I will not do it again. I know, Henry said. I would not ask you to. You would be asking me to accept a great deal of uncertainty, she said. A man whose work puts him in regular danger, a man who has no fixed place. Yes, he said. Which is why I am not asking you to accept anything right now. I am telling you that I would like to stay, and I am asking if that is welcome. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the street again, and then she said, quite quietly, It is welcome. Henry let out a slow breath. But slowly, she said. I go slowly. That is fine, he said. I am not going anywhere. He meant it. He had not meant something with this particular completeness in a very long time. He stayed in Caldwell through the summer and through the fall, and the thing that developed between them had the quality of something built carefully by skilled hands, nothing rushed, nothing forced, but each piece placed with attention and allowed to settle before the next piece was added. Henry took short jobs when they came, nothing that kept him away more than a few days at a time, and he was honest with her about what he did and where he went. And when he came back, she was always there and always, carefully, genuinely glad to see him. He began to learn the craft of watching her work, which was something he had never expected to find absorbing. She let him watch on the afternoons when the light was good and she was doing detailed work, and she explained what she was doing as she did it, not because he asked her to, but because she was a person who liked to share what she understood about things, and talking about her work was as natural to her as breathing. He learned about grain and nap in fabric, about how bias-cut pieces behaved differently from straight-grain pieces, about the way different weights of fabric responded to movement. He learned about the theatrical principle she called character construction, the way she built a complete human biography into every costume she made, so that the actor wearing it would feel who the character was without being told. He learned that the disguise she had made for him was not an improvisation, but an application of deep expertise to a specific problem, and that she had known it would work before he walked out the door because she had checked every detail twice. He was deeply, thoroughly, repeatedly impressed by her, and each time he was impressed he fell a little further in love, which was a mechanism he had not previously experienced and which he found both alarming and wonderful. In October, Dawes sent a letter. It came addressed to Caroline at the shop, and she brought it to him one afternoon with an expression that was controlled and calm. And he read it, and it was the kind of letter that was not quite a threat, but was the close cousin of one careful language that expressed displeasure and made certain implications about how that displeasure might eventually be expressed. Henry sat with that letter for an hour, turning it in his hands, and then he said, "I want to go to Wichita." Caroline looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because Prout, now that he is in custody and facing serious time, has reason to talk," Henry said. "And I think if someone who knows how to have that conversation were to go to Sumner County and have it, Prout could be encouraged to testify about his relationship with Dawes. And a marshal who is the subject of a formal federal investigation tends to be considerably less interested in sending threatening letters." "That is a good plan," Caroline said. "It will take 2 weeks. I know. I will come back." She looked at him with those green eyes that he now knew by heart, the particular way they caught light in the morning, the way they went serious and focused when she was thinking hard, the way they went warm and less guarded in the evenings when she was tired and relaxed and most herself. And she said, "I know you will." He went to Sumner County. He had the conversation with Prout that needed having, which required patience and a willingness to make certain representations about what the territorial prosecutor was likely to offer in exchange for cooperation. And by the end of it, Prout had signed a statement that detailed a 5-year arrangement with Marshal Dawes that included protection, information sharing, and 2 instances of evidence suppression. Henry filed that statement with the Federal District Office in Topeka, which was beyond Dawes' jurisdiction in the most absolute possible sense. The formal federal investigation of Luther Dawes was opened 6 weeks later. It moved slowly, as such things did, but it moved, and Dawes was suspended from his position within the year and formally charged within 2 years, and the eventual outcome was as complete as such outcomes ever were. When Henry rode back into Caldwell after his 2 weeks in Sumner County, he came in the late afternoon, and Missouri moved through the familiar streets with the easy gait of a horse who recognized a known place, and Henry felt something he had not felt anywhere since Ohio, which was the specific and domestic comfort of coming home. Caroline was in the shop when he arrived. She was finishing a dress for Mrs. Harlan's daughter. The wedding was next month, and she looked up when he came through the door with the same quick assessment she always made, checking, confirming he was whole and well. And then she crossed the room and took his face in both her hands, which were the capable, calloused hands of a woman who had worked with them all her life, and she kissed him. Henry stood very still for one heartbeat, and then he was completely, immediately certain, and he kissed her back with everything he had. And it was the kind of moment that a person can feel shifting something fundamental in the structure of their life, the kind of moment that makes before and after make sense as categories. When they separated, Caroline's cheeks were flushed and her composure was, for once, genuinely disordered, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen before, unguarded in a way that her face almost never was, open and uncertain and hopeful in a way that told him this mattered to her as much as it mattered to him. "Dawes?" she asked. "Handled," he said. "He will not be a problem." She exhaled, slow and complete, and leaned her forehead briefly against his chest, and he put his arms around her and she let him, and they stood in the quiet of her shop in the late October afternoon with the smell of fabric and thread and Kansas autumn through the cracked window, and it was the most at peace Henry could remember being. He was very much in love with Caroline Gentry. He had been for some time. He had simply been waiting to be sure because she deserved certainty. He was sure. The winter of 1878 was severe, as Kansas winters often were, with winds that came out of the north like something personal and bitter cold that turned the streets to ice and kept most of the town hunkered indoors. Henry moved from the boarding house, which he had been in too long and paying too much for, into the small room above the shop storage space that Caroline had been using for overflow inventory. And this was a practical arrangement that they both acknowledged as practical while being privately aware that it was also something else. They fell into a life. Henry helped with the heavy work deliveries, furniture, the general physical demands of running a business in a frontier town where infrastructure was in permanent catch-up with the number of people who needed it. He took short jobs when they came and longer jobs when nothing could be helped, and he was honest with Caroline about every one of them and came back from every one of them. He helped her build a small secondary storage space onto the back of the shop, working with lumber and tools he had learned in Ohio. And the result was not beautiful, but it was solid and it did not leak, which were the primary criteria. Caroline continued to run her business with the same concentrated excellence she had always brought to it. The wedding dress for the Harlan daughter was completed in November and caused something of a sensation at the wedding, not because it was ostentatious, but because it was perfectly fitted, perfectly proportioned, the kind of dress that made the woman wearing it feel exactly like herself at her best. 3 other women in town approached Caroline within a month with wedding dress commissions, which meant that the winter, despite the weather, was financially comfortable. She also took a theater commission that winter from a traveling company that came through Caldwell on its way to Wichita, a full wardrobe for a production of a melodrama, which required 7 complete period costumes in 3 weeks, which was an aggressive timeline by anyone's accounting. Henry watched her work through that commission with something approaching awe. She organized the work with the precision of a military campaign, broke the 7 costumes into their component construction tasks, prioritized and sequenced and executed with a speed and accuracy that had him checking his watch, and then checking again, because the numbers did not seem possible. The company left with 7 perfect costumes, and Caroline put the payment in her strongbox with the expression of a woman who has done exactly what she set out to do and knows it. One evening in January, when the wind was howling outside and the stove in the back room was working hard and they were sitting together, Caroline sewing by lamplight and Henry reading the newspaper that had arrived 3 days late from Kansas City, she said, without looking up from her work, "If you took fewer jobs, what would you do?" Henry looked up. "What do you mean?" "If you stopped bounty hunting entirely or nearly entirely, what would you do for work? You are capable. You are observant. You are extremely good at working with your hands, which I have been watching for 3 months. What would you do?" He thought about it honestly. "I could ranch. I know cattle well enough. I could work as a sheriff's deputy, which is not so different from what I already do but is steadier and stays in one place. I could," he paused because a thought had occurred to him. "I could do security work. There are enough banks and freight operations in the territory that need someone who can assess and manage security threats. That is not so different from bounty hunting, but it keeps a man in one place." Caroline set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to stop doing what you do," she said clearly. "I want to be accurate about that. I'm not asking you to sacrifice a thing." "I know," he said. "But I am also not going to pretend that I am not thinking about the future," she said, "because I am always thinking about the future. It is how I am built." Henry set down his newspaper. "Then let us talk about the future." They talked for 3 hours, about practicalities and possibilities and what a life built together might look like, and what each of them needed it to be. And it was one of the most honest and specific conversations Henry had ever had. And at the end of it they were agreed on enough things, and the things they were not yet agreed on were things they both understood needed more time. He asked her to marry him in February, on a Thursday afternoon when the sun was out and the snow was melting, and Caldwell had the battered, optimistic look of a place surviving toward spring. He did not have a ring yet because he was working on that. He asked her in the shop directly and simply because she deserved directness and simplicity, and he told her that he loved her and that he had been certain of it since October and that he would keep being honest with her about everything for as long as she would let him. Caroline looked at him for a long moment with those serious, assessing green eyes, and then she said, "Yes, on one condition. Name it. You take the security work instead of the bounty hunting. Not because I am afraid for you, but because I have done the mathematics on the long-term risk, and the mathematics favor the change." He almost laughed, but he did not because she was completely serious. "All right," he said. "And you agree that this shop is mine and the decisions about it are mine, and you do not have opinions about how I run it unless I ask you." "I have no opinions about how you run it," he said. "I have only been deeply impressed by how you run it." Something warm moved through her expression. "Then yes," she said. He kissed her again, and this time there was nothing uncertain about either of them. The ring came from the jeweler in Wichita. Henry made the trip in March, on the first decent weather day, and spent 2 hours in the jeweler's shop on Douglas Avenue working with the jeweler to commission something specific. He had described Caroline to the jeweler, her hands, her work, her precision, and said that he needed something that would not catch on thread or fabric, that was simple and well-made rather than showy, that would suit a woman who appreciated craftsmanship over display. The jeweler had been a German immigrant named Hoffman who had come west in the 1860s and who understood what it meant to do careful work with your hands, and he had made Henry a ring that was exactly right. A plain gold band with a narrow border of engraved detail at the edges, clean and well-proportioned, the kind of thing that would be there every day and would age well. Henry brought it back to Caldwell on a Thursday and gave it to Caroline on a Saturday in the evening, when the week's work was done and the shop was closed and the lamplight was warm. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she put it on her right hand first by accident, and then moved it to her left with a very small, self-contained smile, and Henry thought that even the small, unguarded moments of this woman were extraordinary. They were married in April by a justice of the peace in the Caldwell courthouse on a weekday morning because neither of them had any interest in a production. 2 witnesses were Mrs. Harlan and Tom Briggs, the livery owner, who had become something like a friend to Henry over the winter. Caroline wore a dress she had made herself, deep green wool with careful detail at the cuffs and collar. Nothing theatrical, nothing excessive, simply the best version of a woman who was exactly herself. Henry wore his good suit, which he had had cleaned and pressed for the first time in what he suspected was longer than he preferred to admit. The justice of the peace, a dry-mannered man named Creighton, performed the service efficiently and with a minimum of embellishment which suited both of them perfectly. When Creighton told Henry he could kiss his bride, Henry did so, and Mrs. Harlan made a small delighted sound and Tom Briggs cleared his throat elaborately. They had lunch at the hotel dining room, the 4 of them, and it was a good lunch. Later, Caroline and Henry walked back to the shop through the spring afternoon, and the whole thing had the quality of something properly done, something real and solid, and exactly what it was supposed to be. Henry transitioned into security work over the spring and early summer, which was less dramatic and more reliable than bounty hunting, and had the considerable virtue of keeping him in Caldwell or within a day's ride of it. He contracted with 2 banks and a freight operation, and he also took a part-time position as a deputy marshal under the Caldwell town marshal, a reasonable man named Garrett who had no political arrangements with anyone more complicated than the town council. The work suited him better than he had expected. It used the same skills: observation, assessment, a thorough understanding of how dangerous people thought and moved, but with more predictability and less isolation. He was good at it, and he knew he was good at it, and coming home at the end of each day to the shop and to Caroline was something he did not take for granted. Caroline's business grew. The theater commissions continued to come. Word had spread through the territorial circuit about the quality of her work, and companies making the western stops began to route specifically through Caldwell to work with her. She hired a young woman named Ruth Elkins, the eldest daughter of a farming family south of town, who was quick and willing to learn and had some natural aptitude for sewing, and began training her in the more basic construction work so that Caroline could focus on the complex, high-skill pieces. Ruth was 17 when she started and 18 within a few months, and she sat at the second cutting table and worked with a focused earnestness that reminded Caroline, sometimes, of her own younger self. And Caroline was a patient and precise teacher who held Ruth to a high standard and explained everything completely, and did not accept sloppy work, and also noticed when Ruth was struggling and addressed it directly rather than leaving the girl to flounder. Henry watched Caroline teach the same way he watched her do everything else, with a kind of attention that had not diminished at all in the months since he had first walked through that door in a panic. She was extraordinary. He knew it and she knew he knew it, and neither of them felt any need to make more of it than it was, which was simply the truth. In the fall of 1879, Caroline discovered she was expecting their first child, which she worked out herself about 3 days before she told Henry, because she had been calculating and cross-referencing and making sure before she said anything. When she told him, she was characteristically precise about it. She stated the fact, explained her certainty, and then looked at him with an expression that was fully, transparently happy in a way that she allowed herself rarely, and that hit Henry with a force he had not anticipated. He crossed the room and took her hands and held them and said, very quietly, "Good. That is very good." She laughed, which was a sound he had worked hard over a year of marriage to produce and still found extraordinary when he managed it. "It is good," she agreed. She worked through most of the pregnancy with minimal concession to it, adjusting her habits and her schedule with the same pragmatic efficiency she brought to everything, and ignoring the well-meaning advice of several women in town who felt she ought to be resting more, on the basis that rest was for people who were ill and she was not ill. She was pregnant, which was a different thing entirely. Henry worried more than he showed, and tried to be useful in practical ways, making sure the backroom stove was always well fueled, ensuring that the heavier deliveries were handled, doing the things that required lifting or moving without being asked, in a way that he hoped was supportive rather than hovering. Caroline allowed this with the grace of a woman who understood the difference between help and control, and appreciated the former while firmly discouraging any attempt at the latter. Their son was born in June of 1880, healthy and loud and completely himself from the first moment, and they named him Thomas James Brooks. Thomas for Thomas Hale, and James for James Gentry, which was Caroline's idea and which Henry loved immediately. Henry held his son for the first time and looked at this new small person with the same thorough, assessing attention he brought to everything, cataloging details. The miniature perfection of the fingers, the extraordinary aliveness of the small face, the strange specific reality of a human person who had not existed 6 months ago and now was here, entirely and completely present. "He has your eyes," Caroline said from the bed, where she was exhausted and luminous in the particular way of a woman who has done a very hard thing very well. "He has your nose," Henry said. "He has his own nose," Caroline said firmly. "He has never met us." Henry looked up at her and felt the love he had for this woman with a clarity that had no bottom to it. Thomas was an energetic baby and then an energetic child, who showed early signs of his mother's observational quality. He was interested in everything around him, tracked movement and detail with an attention that was notable, and had strong preferences about how things should be organized that he expressed loudly and often. Caroline found this delightful in a way that Henry suspected was at least partly because the trait was familiar. The shop continued to evolve. By 1881, Caroline had expanded into the adjacent space when it came available, using the room to establish a dedicated fitting area that made the whole operation more professional. She had a regular clientele now that included women from as far as 30 miles away who came specifically for her work, and the theatrical commissions had become a significant portion of her income. Ruth Elkins, now Ruth Albright after marrying the farmer's son from 2 properties over, continued to work with her and had developed into a genuinely skilled seamstress under Caroline's instruction. Henry's security work had grown too. He had a formal contract with the Caldwell Bank and with a freight company that ran a regular route between Caldwell and Wichita, and his assessment reports had a reputation for thoroughness that brought him 2 additional consulting contracts with operations further north. He had effectively built a small consultancy out of a skill set he had developed across 11 years of a very different profession, and it supported his family well and kept him home most evenings. He had hung up his bounty hunting entirely by the spring of 1881, and he did not miss it the way he had expected to. What he had thought he loved about that work, the movement, the solving of problems, the use of the specific skills he found he had in other forms now. Movement he had with Thomas, who was small and fast and had no interest in staying in one place. Problem solving he had in the security assessments and in the practical demands of a house and a business and a life. And the skills he had, the observation, the reading of people, the understanding of how dangerous things worked, he had those too, and they were useful in ways that did not require him to sleep alone in boarding houses and wonder if the next job would be the one that went wrong in an unfixable way. He had been right. That night in the livery in October of 1878, when he had understood that he had found something he had not been looking for. He had just not known yet how fully or how well it would fit. In the summer of 1882, Henry came home from a 3-day consulting trip to Wichita to find Caroline in the back room of the shop with an expression that he recognized as the one she wore when she had been doing calculations. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. We are going to have another child." Henry sat down on the stool by the cutting table. "When?" "February, I believe." He was quiet for a moment, doing his own calculation. Thomas was almost 2. The shop was busy. The consulting work was steady. They were doing well. "All right," he said. "Good. What do you need?" Caroline looked at him with those green eyes and the warm expression that she reserved for moments when he said exactly the right thing, which he had learned to recognize and still found deeply satisfying to produce. "At the moment, I need you to tell Thomas that the spool rack is not a toy," she said. "He has been reorganizing it all afternoon." Henry went and found his son, who had indeed organized the spools into a pattern of his own devising that was both more elaborate and less logical than the one Caroline used, and explained, with the patient repetition that small children require, that the spools needed to go back where they belonged. Thomas explained his own system back to Henry with great confidence and minimal vocabulary, and Henry listened to all of it and then helped put the spools back. And Thomas helped very seriously and only reorganized 2 of them after they were done, which Henry decided to consider a success. Their daughter was born in February of 1883, on a cold morning when the snow was thick on the ground, and the midwife arrived from 3 streets over wrapped in 2 coats and looking brisk. She was smaller than Thomas had been but no less loud, and she had Caroline's auburn hair from the moment she arrived, and they named her Eleanor Ruth Brooks Eleanor, because it was a name both of them liked, Ruth for the young woman who had learned her craft under Caroline's instruction. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, examined his new sister with the same careful attention he brought to all interesting things and declared her small, which was accurate, and then lost interest in favor of a complex project. He was engaged in that involved blocks and did not, apparently, require a baby sister. Alina was different from Thomas from the beginning, quieter in some ways but more observant, watching the world with those auburn-fringed eyes with a focus that seemed too comprehensive for such a young person. By the time she was walking, she was following Caroline around the shop with a dedicated attention that made Caroline laugh and made Henry think that the next generation of whatever Caroline Gentry had built was already in the room and paying close attention. The years that followed had the quality of a life well built and well lived. Caldwell grew, as towns in the territory were growing more permanently settled, more businesses, a school that expanded from 1 room to 2 and then to 3, a proper bank building, a newspaper. The cattle drives continued but began to shift as the railroad extended its reach, and the character of the town changed gradually from a trail town to something more settled and domestic, without ever losing entirely the frontier energy that had always been its particular flavor. Caroline's shop grew with the town. She took on 2 more employees in the years after Alina's birth, both young women who came to her with varying levels of skill and who left, years later, with considerably more. She taught with the same directness and high standards that she had always brought to Ruth, and she had a reputation as a teacher that brought her apprentices from as far as Wichita. The theatrical commissions eventually led to a connection with a production company in Kansas City that offered Caroline a consulting arrangement. They would send her the design requirements for each production's wardrobe. She would provide construction plans and material specifications, and they would execute it in their workshop with her remote guidance. It was a new kind of arrangement that required an entirely new kind of correspondence and documentation, and Caroline developed it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, creating a written system for communicating costume construction that was precise enough to be executed without her being physically present. Henry watched her develop this system over the course of a winter and thought, not for the first time, that she was operating well ahead of the moment she was in, doing something that would probably become standard practice in the industry eventually, but doing it first because she had the analytical capacity to see that it needed to exist. He told her this one evening, and she looked at him with the quietly pleased expression that she reserved for compliments she had decided to accept. "Someone was going to figure it out," she said. "Someone was always going to figure it out," he agreed. "But you figured it out first." Thomas grew into a boy of particular intensity and mechanical curiosity. He was fascinated by how things worked, by the new machinery that was beginning to appear in the territory, by the steam engines and the telegraph equipment, and the emerging infrastructure of a modernizing country. He asked questions constantly and in great depth, and did not accept vague answers, a trait that Henry recognized from his mother and was delighted by and also occasionally exhausted by. Alina grew into a girl who had Caroline's observational quality paired with a different kind of output, where Caroline's observations went into construction and pattern and design, Alina's went into drawing. By the time she was 6, she was making detailed sketches of everything around her, and the sketches had the quality of a person who was actually seeing what they drew rather than drawing what they thought they saw. Caroline recognized this immediately and made sure Alina had good paper and real pencils rather than the inferior alternatives. One afternoon when Alina was 7, Caroline came to find Henry in the small office he had built in the back of the adjacent storage room, where he kept his consulting files and his correspondence. She had one of Alina's drawings in her hand. "Look at this," she said. Henry looked. It was a sketch of the shop's front window, the display Caroline had dressed that morning, with a theatrical costume she was working on. Alina had drawn it with detail that was, frankly, startling. The proportions were correct. The texture differences between fabric types were suggested with different mark making. The way the light fell through the window was accurately observed. "She is 7, Henry said. "I know," Caroline said. "She needs proper instruction." "There is a woman in Wichita," Caroline said, "who teaches drawing and painting. I have been corresponding with her about a possible arrangement." Henry looked at his wife, who had clearly been thinking about this for some time before bringing it to him, and felt the love for her that had not diminished by one particle in the years since it had found its proper shape. "Then do it," he said. "It will be expensive," Caroline said, which was a consultation, not an objection. "Then we will budget for it," he said. "She is 7 years old and she can draw like that. We are not going to leave that alone." Eleanor began traveling to Wichita with Caroline once a month for lessons, and the results over the following years were substantial. By the time she was 12, Eleanor's work had the quality of a person who had been taught properly and had a natural gift that instruction had clarified rather than imposed. She began applying her drawing to her mother's work, producing detailed costume sketches that Caroline used in her design documentation for the Kansas City arrangement, and the sketches were good enough that the production company began requesting them specifically. Henry, in his middle 40s, had the particular quality of a man who had found his place and made something of it. He was settled, professionally recognized in his field in the region, well regarded in Caldwell's community. He had the particular pleasure of watching both his children grow into people he respected and was interested by. He had the even more particular pleasure of waking up every morning next to a woman who continued to surprise him and impress him, and who, he had come to understand, was always going to be slightly ahead of him in most things, which had turned out to be not a diminishment but an education. He had expected, at some point, to stop being surprised by her. He never did. There was the afternoon in 1886 when a representative from a catalog company in Chicago came to Caldwell specifically to speak with Caroline about licensing her pattern documentation system for wider publication. He had heard about it through the Kansas City production company, who had mentioned it to a theater contact in Chicago, who had mentioned it to someone at the catalog company. Caroline negotiated that arrangement with a precision that left the Chicago representative looking slightly dazed, and Henry, who had sat in on the meeting at Caroline's request, watched the whole thing with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching someone he loves demonstrate, to a stranger, exactly what they are. There was the evening in 1888 when a fire started in the hardware store next to the shop and threatened to spread, and Caroline, who had moved her most important equipment and pattern documentation to the back lot within 3 minutes of the smoke being visible, directed a bucket brigade line with a clarity and efficiency that the fire department arrived to find already largely doing their job for them. The shop took smoke damage to the front room but lost nothing structural and nothing irreplaceable, and the reason was entirely that Caroline had prepared for this possibility years before, with the same forward-thinking intelligence she had brought to every challenge in her life. Henry had dragged her away from the smoke-damaged front room that night, coughing and with soot on her face, and held her very tightly for a moment, and she had let him. "We are all right," she had said into his shoulder. "We are all right," he had agreed. "We are very all right." They rebuilt the front room better than it had been, with proper fire prevention features that Caroline specified, and that the builder argued with until Henry showed up at the conversation and made certain points about the contractor's continued business relationship with the bank and the freight company, which resolved the argument quickly, and the specifications were followed exactly. In the spring of 1889, Thomas, at 9 years old, saw a demonstration of a small gasoline engine at the county fair in Wichita, and came home unable to talk about anything else for 3 weeks. He had somehow managed to speak at length with the engineer demonstrating the engine, and had come away with a considerable amount of technical information that he had then proceeded to cross-reference with everything he could find in books, and he announced one evening at dinner that he was going to build his own engine when he was older. Henry, who had ridden a horse named Missouri for 15 years because horses were what there was, thought about this for a moment and then said, "What do you need to understand better first?" Thomas told him. At length, Henry could follow about half of it, Caroline, he noticed, was following all of it and asking occasional precise questions that steered Thomas toward the gaps in his current understanding, which Thomas then became immediately determined to fill. After Thomas had gone to bed, Henry said to Caroline, "He is going to do it. He is going to do it," she agreed. "He will need better education than this region currently offers. We should start thinking about that." They started thinking about it. This was how Caroline approached most things, not when they became urgent, but before, so that when they became urgent she was already in motion. Alina, at 6, was not yet thinking about engines, but she was thinking about everything else. She had begun combining her drawing with her mother's design work in ways that had genuine creative depth. She was not just documenting Caroline's designs. She was beginning to propose alternatives and variations, and some of those alternatives were genuinely interesting. Caroline looked at them with the honest eye of an expert and told Alina when an idea did not work and why, and told her when an idea was good, and Alina received both with the same focused attention. Henry, watching his daughter and his wife work together in the shop on an autumn afternoon, thought about a girl in Ohio a long time ago who had wanted to see the territories, who had gotten on a horse and ridden west at 23. He thought about 11 years of boarding house rooms and cold trail food. He thought about a woman with auburn hair and green eyes who had held out a hat and said, "Put it on," with infuriating composure, and who had already sewn the disguise he needed before he walked through the door. He thought about how the life that had grown from that moment was so much more than anything he would have designed for himself if he had been designing, because the woman who was at the center of it was so much more than he had known to look for. He was 51 years old in the spring of 1895, and Caroline was 45, and they had been married 17 years, and he was still impressed by her on a regular basis. And she still occasionally caught him watching her work with that quiet, focused attention, and looked up at him with those green eyes, and said something precise and direct that made him feel more himself than anything else in the world managed to. Thomas was 15, and was deep in a self-directed engineering education that had outrun what any teacher in Caldwell could provide, and was beginning to draw interest from the technical school in Lawrence, which Henry and Caroline were actively investigating. He was tall and intense, and had Henry's build and Caroline's mind, and was, by any measure, a remarkable young person. Alina was 12, and had developed her drawing into something that people who understood art described as real talent. Her costume sketches for her mother's Kansas City work were now regularly praised by the production company as the best design documentation they worked with, and she had begun illustrating stories for the Caldwell newspaper, which published them with the credit "Illustrations by E. Brooks," and received more mail about the illustrations than about most of the articles. The shop was 20 years old, by the counting that started with Caroline's arrival in Caldwell in the late 1870s, and it was nothing like what it had been. It occupied the entire original space and the adjacent space, and had a front window that displayed its current work in a way that people stopped to look at. And it employed 3 women full-time and 2 part-time. And the pattern documentation system that Caroline had developed was now licensed to 3 separate publishing enterprises, and had been cited in 2 articles about the modernization of theatrical production management. And Caroline Gentry Brooks was at the center of all of it, still moving through her shop with the ease of someone completely at home in their own space, still touching this and adjusting that with a familiarity that spoke of long relationship with every object and tool, still humming almost inaudibly when a piece of work was going particularly well, still making calculations with her green eyes that nobody else in the room had started yet. Henry came into the shop one Thursday afternoon in May with Missouri's replacement, a younger bay horse he had bought the year before and named, at Thomas's insistence, Engine, because Thomas had been on an engine theme for approximately 2 years tied at the rail out front. He had been to the bank for a meeting about the security contract renewal, and he had stopped at the mercantile on the way back, and he was carrying a paper-wrapped parcel that contained 2 pounds of good coffee, which Caroline had asked him to get 3 days ago and which he had finally remembered. She was at the sewing machine. She did not look up because she was at a critical juncture. He set the coffee on the counter and waited. After 90 seconds, the machine stopped. She looked up. She looked at him with those green eyes that he knew by heart and that still, after 17 years, had the capacity to make him feel clearly and specifically seen. "Coffee," she said. "Coffee," he confirmed. She came around the cutting table and took the parcel, and she looked up at him with an expression that was everyday and familiar, and also, underneath that, the same thing it had always been, that complicated, warm, completely clear thing that was not reducible to any simpler description. "Tom Briggs asked me this morning," Henry said, "if we were planning to be in Caldwell for the next 20 years the same way we have been for the last 20. "What did you tell him?" Caroline asked. "I told him I would have to consult my wife," Henry said. She smiled, a real, full smile, the kind she gave rarely and he valued highly. "What a good answer," she said. "I thought so," he said. She set the coffee down on the counter and put her hands on either side of his face, the way she had done the first time she kissed him in this same shop, a long time ago when a man had ridden back from Sumner County and the autumn had been beginning, and she looked at him for a moment with everything in her eyes that she rarely put anywhere else. "Yes," she said, "we are planning to be in Caldwell." "Good," he said. He meant it. He had meant it from the moment he had been certain, and certainty had never left. It had only grown more specific and more complete with every year, the way things that are well-built do. Outside, Caldwell was doing what it did, the ordinary business of a May afternoon, horses and wagons, and people going about their lives in the particular place they had chosen or arrived at or built, the way people do everywhere and always. The Kansas sky was enormous and blue above it, the way it always was, with the kind of light that made the prairie look like it went on forever, which it more or less did. Inside the shop, Caroline went back to her work, and Henry went to his office to file his bank meeting notes, and Thomas was at school learning things he had already exceeded and would need to be moved on from soon, and Alina was somewhere drawing something that would probably be excellent, and the life they had made was entirely and completely itself. It had started, in its way, with a disguise already sewn, with a woman who had thought 3 steps ahead of a stranger's desperation, and prepared for it, out of intelligence and forward-thinking, and a particular fierce determination not to be caught without recourse again. With a man who had walked through a door in a panic and found something he had not been looking for, and had been wise enough to recognize it and stay. It had become something neither of them had designed, because that is the nature of things built by 2 people who are both paying full attention. They become more than either person could have made alone, and they continue to become, year after year, more specific and more real. Henry Brooks, who had spent 11 years sleeping in other people's places and calling himself a stranger everywhere he went, was home. He had been home for a long time. And Caroline Gentry, who had ridden west with her sewing equipment and her mother's pattern books, and a determination so ferocious it had taken her 2,000 miles, had built exactly what she set out to build, and then, unexpectedly and precisely right, had found that she had built room for more than she planned. The sewing machine started up again in the other room, and with it, barely audible above the rhythmic mechanical sound, the small, unconscious hum of a woman doing work that was going very well. Henry smiled at his filing. All was as it should be.